Hi students, so this is a brief introduction to our new topic on liberalism, one of the core ideologies for Unit 1. So we've come across liberalism in many times actually, particularly in Unit 1 when we did liberal democracy and also when we did political parties and the Liberal Democrat Party. So I think you probably have a good idea of what the core ideas and values of liberalism are. And indeed, if we were in class now, I would ask you to brainstorm what you could remember. And hopefully you would come up with some ideas like this, that in a liberal democracy based on sort of liberal values, we would expect to see freedoms, so freedom of speech, a freedom of assembly. So we would see those written down in something like the Human Rights Act in a liberal democracy. And we would see the importance of individuals. In other words, that's why freedom is so important and why the rule of law is so important, this idea that we should all be treated equally. We would talk probably about the importance of social justice, so everybody had equality of opportunity. We would talk about the idea that individuals had equal rights. We would talk about the importance of a government being limited and having regular elections and a government respecting civil liberties. We would talk about tolerance, a pluralist democracy where different views are encouraged, whether it's through pressure groups or through political parties. Possibly we wouldn't have mentioned this one, but it's also a core value of liberalism that we'll come back to, about rationalism, that basically humans are reasonable people, they're logical people, they are capable of making their own choices. So liberalism, actually, if you can look at all these values, is actually an optimistic ideology, and especially that last one actually believes that we can progress and society can progress and we can get better and better. Now, we're going to come back to all of those in a minute, but it's clear from looking at these values and thinking about liberal democracy that this has been one of the most influential ideologies, or the most influential ideology of the 20th, 19th and 20th centuries. If you think of the number of governments, particularly in Western Europe, that have embraced liberal democracy, particularly after 1945 and also after the collapse of communism in 1989, 1990. In fact, at the end of the Cold War in 1990, a political theorist called Fukuyama argued that actually we were seeing the end of history. Slightly bizarre, and indeed it was a bit bizarre, but what did he mean by that? He meant that liberal democracy had won. That was it. Liberal democracy had defeated the one-party totalitarian communist Soviet Union, and that was it. We were on an upward trajectory, again, very optimistic that we're on an upward trajectory, that liberal democracy would now be the standard form of government. Of course, we've seen that is not the case. Many other forces have come into play in global politics. And indeed, although 2/3 of states might be classed as liberal democracies now, if you look at this cartoon, we see a common theme in politics at the moment, which is that actually liberal democracy is under threat from various groups, populist leaders, right-wing groups that are questioning and threatening some of those values that we talked about on the first slide. So here we have an economist cartoon, which is quite great. Western liberal democracies hiding behind the figure of liberal democracy herself, under threat from the arrows. And we can see a major reason why liberal democracy is under threat here, because of the leader of the liberal free world, Donald Trump, busy tweeting and having thrown down his shield. So these kind of headlines, democracy in crisis, are very common at the moment. So we can see from that liberal democracy, really important ideology for the modern world. Where did it all start? Well, before the 18th century, society was very much like this. So this is taking you back to year 7 history here. Our feudal society with the Pope, followed by the monarch, king or queen, that could be. We'd probably be down there with the peasants. So you can see there was your position in society, very well structured, and you had to do what the king said and what the Pope, of course, it was the Catholic Church only at this time, what the Pope and so your priest in your village would tell you to do. So in the 17th, 18th century, this starts to be challenged, these ideas. And particularly through the upper middle classes, the scientific community, thinkers, who all start to question that kind of structure and question the fact that we should be following what the king, queen, pope were telling us. And this was the age of enlightenment, or what also became known as the age of reason, also coincided with the scientific revolution age. And people started to really think, well, maybe we can actually think things out for ourselves. Maybe kings or queens should not have freedom to do whatever they want and tell us whatever they want to do. Maybe they should have to prove themselves. Maybe we shouldn't have to. Maybe we can overthrow them even if they don't act as good leaders. So we see a lot of new ideas coming out that actually lead to partly the English Civil War, but particularly the American and the French revolutions. And this is obviously radical stuff, as you can see by the outcome of the, for instance, French Revolution, where the monarch actually gets killed. These ideas are threatening this whole way of life of a structured society where you actually know your position. They're threatening this idea of the divine right of kings, that kings and queens are put there by God. They're challenging the political and economic privileges of the landed aristocracy and the situation of a feudal system where you are born into a position. And they're actually suggesting things like freedom of religion. So if we have a look there halfway down, Francois Voltaire, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, really radical ideas. And if you look at all of these, if you look at the top one by Thomas Hobbes, kings have no power from God, but power from the people. These are really challenging the structure that has lasted for hundreds of years. So I want you to have a look through those ideas on your own by those different English and French philosophers there, and to do the task on page 5 of your workbooks and put that up onto Google Classroom. So just back to the core values that we started off, and a little bit more detail about that, because these underpin everything that we're going to talk about in terms of liberalism. So we talked a bit about rationalism there. This is a really important part of liberal thought, that basically, as we are rational, and because we're rational, therefore we should have as much freedom as possible. And because we should have as much freedom as possible, therefore we don't need to have a strong government to order us around, because we are rational and we do sort of the best possible thing. And of course, that rational thought also is based on the idea that everybody's rational, and so is very optimistic in its belief that if we all sit around and discuss things, we can come to the right solution in the end. So we'll see that in global politics. When we talk about liberalism in global politics, we're talking about the idea of institutions that help people sit around and discuss things to avoid a war or conflict. So that's a really important idea of liberalism. Linked, of course, to the idea of the individual. So this is the beating heart of liberalism, and it shows the real contrast of liberalism to the other ideology that you're doing on socialism. The individual is the most important thing ever, and that's why you can't have a very strong government. And it also means, it's also linked to the idea that of tolerance, that the individual should be allowed to get on with what he or she wants to do without other people interfering, and that obviously, because you're rational, you're going to allow other people to do the same thing with you as well. It's linked to a key idea, which is foundational equality. That means that we're all born equal, and therefore that we should all have equal rights. Tied to that, because they're all linked together, is freedom. So we're all individuals, we're all rational, and we should have the freedom, therefore, to pursue our own desires, needs, and wants, and to develop in the way that's in any way that we can. And Locke and Jefferson, key thinkers, consider this to be a natural right, as they called it. And Locke famously said, where there is no law, there is no freedom. So we do need some kind of law. We can't just be allowed to sort of have a complete anarchy, or so they're not anarchists. We do actually need some kind of law, some kind of state, but it really has to be limited and not too strong. As we'll see as we go along, liberalism divides into two sort of camps or two strands: classical liberalism and modern liberalism. The classical liberals believed actually that we should be able to do anything we want, and that basically the state cannot interfere with that at all, and that's what we call negative freedom. Other liberals came along later and said, well, actually, the state needs to do a little bit more, because you can't really be free unless the state helps you out, maybe with health or education, or helps people in real poverty. And that became a sort of a modern idea of what we call positive freedom that we'll look at a bit later on. Another key value, equality and social justice. So again, back to the idea that we are born equal, which is what we call foundational equality, that we should be bound by the rule of law, and the equality under the law, so that treatment as we go through society of equality, is known as formal equality. So foundational equality is basically that we're born equal and have equal rights. Formal equality is that equality in society, that we should all have the same legal and political rights, the same voting rights, and so on. And of course, part of that is also equality of opportunity. So we should all have the same access to education, to health, and everything else. But we shouldn't end up all being equal. We're not going to end up all being equal, because we all have different talents and different skills. So actually, the best kind of society is what we call a meritocracy, where the people who are the hardest working, who use their talents to the full, climb to the top and deserve their positions at the top. So we're not talking about a socialist society here where everyone's going to end up equal by any means at all. So we've mentioned this a couple of times. The state. What do the Liberals think about a state? Well, as we've seen, they do think it should exist, but it's a necessary evil. It's there to prevent disorder, to protect the most vulnerable, and to protect those individual rights that we keep going on about. But it can't really be trusted. You've got to make sure that you have a government which is limited. I'll come to that in a minute. This idea that power corrupts, and that you might end up with a ruler taking too much power and taking away your individual rights and your individual liberties. So they also believe, therefore, that the state is an artificial creation. And this leads to another term, something called mechanistic theory, which we'll talk about again later on. The only reason the state exists is to protect individuals, so it is an artificial creation. And if you do have a state, you've got to have a limited government with checks and balances. And of course, a Bill of Rights to protect your rights, your individual rights and freedoms. And the state absolutely mustn't interfere in the economy either. So we'll look at that a bit later on, but capitalism fits very nicely to liberalism, because it's all about the individuals doing what they want, making their money, keeping their money, and the government really should not interfere in that. And of course, liberal democracy is the ultimate form of government that most liberals support, particularly since the 19th century, because that has all of those things that are important for protecting the individual, providing equality, providing social justice, and providing freedoms. No other form of government would work for the liberals at all. But they are really scared about the idea of tyranny of the majority, which we have talked about in terms of things like referendums, haven't we? This idea that actually you could have a democracy and you could have 52% voting for something, 48% voting against, and that 48% will always lose their freedoms because they're being told what to do by that majority. And we've seen that argument again in current democracy. And that is a real fear for Liberals in terms of the protecting of their rights of the individuals. So there's a lot of stuff there. You need to go back over, read pages through to page 7 and 8 in the booklet, and then write in the definitions of the words at the end there on pages 8 and 9 to show your understanding of the key ideas of liberalism, and then put those up onto Google Classroom. Okay, good luck.